We are here in the studio, the virtual studio, with none other than Logan Kilpatrick, developer advocate at OpenAI, and somebody whom I've had the joy of corresponding with for several years at this point. Huge advocate for Julia Lang, which is a data science statistical language. In addition to Python and R, there's Julia. And you've been very instrumental, it sounds like, in helping raise awareness of that and getting more people using it and learning how to use it. And we're gonna talk about that. We're gonna talk about your time at OpenAI. But of course, I want to dive straight in and welcome you. Welcome.
Thank you, Quincy. This is going to be awesome. I'm such a fan of freeCodeCamp, and I think the work that you and the team and the entire community are doing is super important. So I'm happy to support where I can and just be a cheerleader from the sideline as well in many cases.
Awesome. Yeah, well, we're very excited to have you cheerleadering, and I will continue to cheerleader for all the amazing tools you all are cooking up over at OpenAI as well. Both, the foundation model that I use many times a day, and the open source projects that we're also using within freeCodeCamp. So I want to start by just diving in. Before you were Logan Kilpatrick, you have so many different hats that you wear. Somebody who has, interned at NASA, somebody who has, who is working as a developer advocate, somebody who is going to lots of conferences and speaking authoritatively on a lot of these topics. And of course, somebody who himself is like an angel investor in the AI space. I want to go back a little bit back to Illinois, because my understanding is that where you grew up?
Yeah, grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, and I'm actually, and we can talk about it, but I'm actually back in the suburbs, or not in the suburbs, now living in the city of Chicago.
Yeah.
Bounced around to California and to Boston, and then met my girlfriend, and then ultimately moved back to Chicago about a year and a half ago.
Amazing. Yeah. So Chicago, of course, central time zone, like Dallas, and slightly larger than Dallas. I think it's the third largest metropolitan area in the United States. A lot of people sleep on Chicago. They're focused on the coast, but Chicago's got a lot going on as well. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about Chicago and like your decision to move back there, because you were living, I think, in the Bay Area, which is where a lot of the AI action is happening. But now, that's a testament to the power of remote work that you can do that, of course. But let's go all the way back, because there's so much we're going to talk about during this conversation in terms of, if you don't mind me using words like precociousness, and, you've studied so many different topics and things like that. But at one point you were just a kid going to school, hoping to go to California. Like Dan's a community college, one of the famous community colleges in the legendary California community college system. If you're looking to go to college, community college in California, if you can get there, that is a very good bet, especially if you happen to live in California and can get like in-state tuition. But like, maybe you can tell me a little bit about what your formative years were like.
Yeah, it's such a good question. Like, I think, I have a lot of conversations with people, and in hindsight, everything looks like it was supposed to happen the way that it did. And I think, like, in the moment, if I put myself back in the shoes of like high school Logan, in 2014, in sophomore year of high school, and like thinking about that experience, like nothing at that point like would have led me to think that I would get the chance to like do the incredible things that I'm doing today. So I'm super happy about that. And I think a lot of it was just like it's fascinating to like be so abstracted out of that world now and like look back, but like nobody cared about technology stuff. Like no one cared about like, building things and like all the things that like I love so much today. Like it's really stuff that like I wasn't exposed to like to the extent that I am today. Like I think of course like I had and have like incredible parents who like were giving me a bunch of opportunities to do a bunch of interesting stuff, but like life was like so focused on like sports and like just trying to like socially survive, and
Yeah.
got a little bit of exposure to computer science stuff because my grandfather was an electrical engineer, and we spent a lot of time like taking apart old computers, but like never really like building a working computer. It was more just like destroying old computers, which was probably not super safe in hindsight, especially because old computers, I'm sure, had a bunch of like terrible stuff inside of them. So
Yeah.
hopefully that doesn't take any years off of my life in the long
Well,
run.
you
But
were you like using the soldering iron and like trying to get like gold out of the motherboard and
literally
stuff?
like pliers and screwdrivers, and we were just like tearing these things apart. I don't really understand. Again, thinking back, I don't really understand why we were doing that, but we had fun doing it. And I think ultimately, like I took AP Computer Science in high school and like literally had no idea what was going on. Like I just remember thinking back to that class, and like it was one of those classes where like they would just like kind of give you an A because you went through all the stuff. But like I really pretty sure I learned like absolutely nothing. And a lot of it, and if I think back, was like, we were learning these concepts in such a vacuum that it was like hard to think like, why will this ever be useful to me? And I think the thing that actually really clicked with like coding and developing stuff that like made me want to like push myself to do more was the game Flappy Bird. Like I saw Flappy Bird
Interesting.
come out and I was like, this is so cool. And then I heard that the guy was making like $500,000 a day or something like that
Yeah.
because Flappy Bird was going so viral. And I was like, wait, does not look that difficult. I should be able to do this. And I think that really like sparked much more of an interest in me to like actually go in and learn what was going on.
Interesting. Flappy Bird. Yeah. Like I mean, phenomenal overnight sensation to the point that people were like selling. The guy kind of freaked out at the success, and he already had more than enough money to like live comfortably for the rest of his life in Vietnam, right? And yeah, he didn't like the way that people were like so addicted to it because he'd get on like the train or whatever, and he'd just see everybody playing Flappy Bird, and he was like, "Oh, they should be like learning or something like that, right?"
Yeah.
But yeah, like that is such an amazing story, like how Flappy Bird of all things inspired you. Kind of like, I mean, it was a big hit. Obviously, it was probably the app of the year. I mentioned earlier, like people were selling iPhones that had Flappy Bird installed
I
at like
remember
a
that.
huge margin because he pulled it from the iPhone store. You couldn't get it anymore, right? And of course, there were lots of clones, but none of them were the original Flappy Bird. Something about that, yeah. So that's what got you inspired. And what were your first steps once you felt inspired by Flappy Bird? Like, how did that change your day to day activity and like your goals?
Yeah, I started, so at the time I didn't have a Mac, and Macs were like out of the, my family had a bunch of Windows computers, and it was like,
Yeah,
oh, well, let's go spend $2,000 on a Mac for no reason. And like, that was kind of like outside the realm of what we were going to do. So the library, where I grew up in Arlington Heights, like had a bunch of Macs, and I went there and like my mom started dropping me off so that I could try to build my own Flappy Bird, clone. And I found this guy, who I should try to reach out to and connect to, Matt Heaney apps, something like that. And he made these really cool tutorials about like how to build iOS applications. And if anyone's tried to do iOS, it is very difficult. It is definitely, at least in my experience, like not the place to start. Like there's just so much going on. Ultimately tried to make something called Flappy Pig. Didn't work out that well because I literally had no idea what I was doing and had to like keep working with the library people because like they had these computers like pretty locked down, and like the Xcode stuff like wanted to do all these crazy things. So it was like this very long and arduous process, but it made me realize like this is the thing that I probably want to do. Like I should go to school and study computer science. And I think the challenge for me at this point was like, I was a decent, like fine student, but like I had never really like tried to make that my goal before. And this was like junior year of high school where I really had this sophomore, junior year of high school, where I had this realization, like,
yeah. I mean,
and
like
meant,
suddenly you really have to kick into gear if you want to get into Harvard.
yeah. And
Foreshadowing a little bit, but yeah,
yeah, and and which is kind of one of those challenges of high school is like the timing is like very unideal. Like you basically like have to be mature at like 12 years old in order to like really
yeah.
be on the right curve to get into a great school right out of high school. And like I was not on that curve, so I did get in a bunch of places. I was thinking about going to Purdue to study computer science and some other places, and
Yeah, very good
ultimately decided
school
like,
in
yeah, in the
the
Midwest.
middle. Is it in Chicago,
I think
Urbana-Champaign or something like
it's
that?
U of I's in Urbana-Champaign, Purdue's in West Lafayette, Indiana, which is like
Okay.
a stone's throw, 2 hours east in Indiana. But ultimately, I wanted to go to Berkeley, and I was fortunate enough that my dad had started at a new job in California, and one of his coworkers' sons had gone through the California community college system, and they were talking, and he told me about this. I was like, wait, this sounds like a really great opportunity. And you foreshadowed this, but like the California community college system is like very unlike every other community college system in the country. Like if you go to community college in Illinois, for example, like it is not this like incredible opportunity that like feeds you into the greatest schools in the country. And like
Yeah.
the California community college system is that, and they've done such a great job of like every single person who is at those schools is like going to end up going to one of the University of California school systems, which are like hard schools to get into and like really great. And yeah, was fortunate that my dad had started that job in California, and I was able to move to California, go to community college at De Anza for a couple of years, and just like meet so many great professors who were like engineers at Apple or Google in their full-time job, and then would come teach a class about software engineering at De Anza at nighttime or something like that. And it was just such a cool experience. And
Yeah, man, that's wild. Just having these world-class engineers at like big tech companies just dropping in, teach some night school classes. Yeah, that sounds like a really amazing opportunity. So you go over, you're able to move over with your dad to NorCal. Like it's in the Bay Area. It's like, is it close to Palo Alto? Where exactly is De Anza?
it's De Anza is literally like less than a mile from Apple's HQ in Cupertino.
Yeah, yeah, that's wild. And while you're there, what do you do? Like, do you do 2 years there, and do community college before transferring to a university?
Yeah, so the plan, the California Community College system has this program called TAG. So if you meet some certain requirements after you've gone through, it's actually not like year based, it's just like the requirement base, which usually takes about like 2 years. Actually, some people it takes 3 years depending on how
Yeah,
long you're there. But you essentially do all these requirements and then you tag into one of the University of California school systems. So of course, they only let you tag into certain UC schools. So, like Berkeley and UCLA, because of how competitive they are not one of the schools that you
yeah,
can tag into. So, you just need to like straight up apply to those schools. So, I applied to Berkeley, which was the school I wanted to go to, got waitlisted, and ultimately didn't end up getting in, and was trying to figure out like what is the next thing. Like, I could have gone to one of the other University of California school systems, but I think I had in this mind that I wanted to like go to the best place possible, and
yeah,
ultimately had also applied to a program at Harvard, and that's what I got into. I think like people have this perception that like Harvard is this incredible school, which it is. If you comparatively look at like Harvard for computer science versus Berkeley for computer science, like Berkeley's a much better school for computer science. Like Harvard's a great school in general, but like
yeah.
Berkeley is where computer science was started, where like all the best computer science stuff happened. So it is, people think Harvard upgrade over Berkeley,
Yeah.
but in some sense, but like really like it was a downgrade for computer science. So again, a nice expectation setting for myself.
Yeah, well, and what you just said, just for anybody who's listening who is, considering applying to universities, maybe you're high school age, maybe you're a non-traditional student thinking about going back to university, what Logan just said there, the university itself, Harvard, of course, generally considered the greatest university on earth by like all the standard like metrics and stuff. Of course, also amazing computer science program, CS50, David
Yeah.
Malin over there. But Berkeley is like in a league of its own, really. And so don't just look at the university, look at the programs and the college within the university. And so different colleges have different levels of prestige and different like caliber of instruction and things like that. So those are some things to think about. Also worth pointing out, you got into Harvard, which is often seen as like the most selective or one of the most selective, and you didn't get into Berkeley. So don't be afraid to apply to multiple schools because, sometimes you might get into what seems to be a more selective institution and not get into a less selective institution. And some of that comes down to just dumb luck, circumstance, whoever the admission person reviewing your application was, maybe your extracurriculars, any number of different circumstances. This is very complicated, and there's not some deterministic path to getting into these different programs. And so it's heartening, kind of, probably not for you, but for me and for other people listening, probably, to hear that you didn't just get into every single program you applied for, that you too faced some degree of, I guess, rejection, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, it's also interesting. Like the thing that I would not have gotten into Harvard if I tried to go in through the normal door that everybody else goes in through. So like there's actually a bunch of other schools have this. Like my little brother went to the University of Pennsylvania, which again is an incredible school,
Yeah.
through like one of these like non-traditional student programs, and that's actually what I went to Harvard through, is like one of the non-traditional student programs that they had. And again, I don't think I would have been able to go if I was just trying, and this is just like one of those lessons in life. Like if you're trying to do the same thing that everyone else is doing, like there's just going to be like more competition, and
Yeah.
you find like sort of these weird like edge cases, and you're able to go and do, like, I don't think I would have gotten into Harvard if I had not found that edge case for myself. So look for those programs. And I think it's more common now that like more and more schools do have those, like it's like not the normal program. Yeah, I don't know what
Yeah.
the best way to frame it is, but Harvard has it, UPenn has it, a bunch of other great schools have them as well. So look for those things if you're a non-traditional college student, especially.
Yeah. Be like the velociraptors in Jurassic Park, like attack the electric fence from all the different angles, and eventually you'll
Yeah.
find a way over the fence into the general population, right? So while you're there, college job, you start working at Apple. And I heard about this on another interview that you've done, and I didn't realize this, but you worked at the Apple store for a couple years. And like, can you talk a little bit about what you learned from working at the Apple store? I mean, Apple, of course, the Apple store literally like ordained by Steve Jobs himself, and so much of like Apple's culture and philosophy and everything like kind of distilled into that retail experience. And there you are working as a retail worker, like a everyday job that lots of people who don't have education hold. And you were working there. What did you learn during that experience?
So much. It was, I think, like the Apple Store was like one of the most formative experiences for me, like growing up. And it was, again, it's like one of those things that like I just applied online and like got lucky enough to make it through the interview, because like it's actually kind of hard to get those jobs too. Like there was this, I went to this recruiting event and there was like a massive number of people there, and it ended up being like a small group of us who were hired, and it was just such a, like a few things that are extremely relevant to me today, which is like how to talk to people who have like such varying levels of technical background. Like you go into a conversation and like one, like especially being at an Apple store in California, like one of the people who I'm trying to help, fix their phone, like could be an engineer at Apple, or we were like a stone's throw away from the Netflix headquarters, like could be
Yeah.
an engineer from Netflix. The next person who comes in could be like a little old grandma who's 80 and like literally has no idea how her phone works, and having to meet people where they're at, both from like a technical perspective, but also like an emotional perspective. Like I don't think people think a lot about this unless this has happened to you, but like the Apple Store is like a really emotional place, like from a bunch of different angles, whether it's like the excitement of, getting a new device and like this new cool thing that you're really excited about, or like the frustration of like, I have something that has my personal data on it, has so many of my memories on it, and it's not working, or like it's not
Yeah.
doing the thing that I'm expecting it to do. So you're really like constantly level setting and matching people across
Yeah.
these like really wide spectrums, and it's such a life lesson. And I don't think like you're not forced into that type of like environment on a very consistent basis, like like I would go out to help customers, and like you're really helping someone for 5 minutes, and then you're going on to the next thing for 8 hours. And like you don't normally in life like get that many shots on goal, to sort of build those skills. And I think it was just such a transformative experience for me.
Interesting. So like every experience, like, and there's so many other emotions that I feel going into like an Apple store, like, oh my gosh, I'm about to spend $1,000 on a phone or whatever, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is like, a week's worth of pay or more, am I getting the right thing? Like, am I gonna look dumb in front of the employee there who knows all this stuff? Am I gonna look like I'm no more sophisticated than the geriatric person who just needs to use a few features on their phone, right? Especially as a developer now, when I go to like an Apple store or something, it's kind of like, they don't know how to talk to me, and at the same time, I don't want to seem pompous and like, oh, I know all about that, So I can only imagine like the sheer number of interesting interactions there have been. And you did this for like 2.5 years.
Yeah, started as a specialist, somebody who like just helps you buy your phone, became like a technical troubleshooting person, became a technical expert. And the cool thing for me was like, so like Apple does such a great job of like building this pipeline from the stores to Apple corporate. So I ended up like lots of folks who I worked with were in college, and like as they were graduating were fortunate enough to like get jobs at Apple corporate. And someone who I knew, my mentor Omar, was like got a job at corporate, referred me for the internship program. I ended up interviewing, and they were like, at the time I, was also going to Harvard and had done some internships and stuff like that. So they were like, yeah, this is actually like such a perfect set of experiences. And like they really wanted someone who had Apple retail experience. And then when I joined Apple, I was a software engineer, like working on retail store apps. Like there's all of these internal applications that power the Apple Store. So I was fortunate enough to do that. And then, worked on some machine learning stuff for the Apple Store too. So like it was all of these experiences. Again, like in the moment, I was like, had no idea that it was going to end up being like extremely useful to my actual job in the future, having had this retail experience. And it ended up being like the differentiator from between solving these problems like well and not being able to solve them at all.
Well, that's also a testament to the Apple Store and like the administration of it, that they saw that you were interested and curious and willing to learn new things, and they gave you kind of the slack to be able to progress with your skills and help in other ways, rather than, amazing. Like you could be like the number one iPhone salesperson in the store or something like that, and like maybe they would be like, well, we need to keep him here because he's already really good at what he's doing. But like they actually let you kind of grow within the role a little bit. That's really good. And I'm curious, like I don't remember the exact timeline because I spent a great deal of time on your website and your LinkedIn trying to like piece together, okay, what is the chronology of Logan Kilpatrick? But like, at what point did you start interning at NASA?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and there's so much. I think the thing that I appreciated about my time in community college is like it is not going back to like the differences between like the regular like traditional 4-year college experience. Like it was not a very social experience, so like I had a lot of free time to work at the Apple Store, to do a bunch of other stuff, because it's like people are like, everyone is like so focused on like getting out of Dianza, essentially getting out of community college is like the thing that people care about, like to go on with the next step of their journey. So I spent a lot of time just like applying for random internships, and was lucky enough at the time. I was like cold reaching out to people on LinkedIn who were researchers at NASA, being like, hey, I'm really interested in the work that you're doing, like would love to hear more, and like come in and talk and like see how I can help. Like have a computer science background, and somebody who I had messaged like 3 months prior ended up messaging me back, being like, oh, hey, like super cool, like you want to come in and like talk. And I went in, and he was like, yeah, like would love to have you on the team. And it was like,
Whoa.
really, it was like that simple. And that was the first team that I worked with, and we were doing some stuff with NASA satellites. Ultimately left that team, applied for a bunch of different internships at NASA after I had a little bit more experience like doing that for a few months, and then joined the team that I ultimately spent like the next like 3 years on, using Julia, doing a bunch of other stuff. So it's
awesome. Well, so again, I'm just trying to like distill what you're saying down into actionable insights for people that are listening. Like, don't be daunted. Don't be afraid to hit up some engineer at NASA and just say like, hey, are there any roles for me there? Like that takes a lot of audacity as a community college student who's working at the, Apple Store. But we can definitely get into Julia, and I'm excited to talk about that. But I want to talk about how you transitioned from going to De Anza to going to Harvard, because again, as we said several times before, like Harvard is like kind of the educational mecca for so many students. It attracts so many ambitious people every year, and it's extremely selective. I think it's like 3 or 4% of people who apply get in. So maybe you can talk about how you got in and what you did there and the difference. Maybe compare and contrast community college where everybody's just trying to get through it to the actual kind of classical college experience that's existed for like 400 years in this country, where people like you lived on campus in Harvard.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I've had a very unique college journey. So at the end of my 2 years at De Anza, I was still in California and decided I was going to go to Harvard. Um, Started looking for, so again, I was part of one of the non-traditional programs at Harvard. So I had the capacity, like I had 2 years left of college. I had to spend a year on campus to fulfill that requirement. But I also had a little bit more flexibility. Like I didn't have to spend both years on campus. I was actually planning to spend both years on campus. But this was also when I was interning at NASA. This was also when I was working at the Apple Store. So I had decided, and like all happened very quickly. Like I would have had to like move to Boston like the next month and like move in and like do all this stuff. And I was like, well, this is a little bit overwhelming. Like I'll move in January and like do the next. So then I'll spend like 3 semesters on campus. So I was still at the Apple Store. I was still um, working at NASA part time, and I did my like first semester remotely, essentially.
Interesting. Like
Did
I
my
didn't even know that was possible. What year was this?
This was 2018.
Okay. So
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 we
they
were on
had like it was
Zoom.
like correspondence courses, or was it like MOOC type where you watch a lecture?
No, it wasn't MOOC. Like, I actually think one of them was more like traditional MOOC type, but the other ones were like live. Like we were actually on Zoom. We were like doing all this stuff like pre-pandemic. Like I think Harvard was like a little like actually around that corner already. Like they had this infrastructure set up, and like there were students in the classroom. There were these like virtual kind of like what again happens with like virtual classrooms today. There was like TVs in the classrooms with like where virtual students were dialing in. Because part of the like non-traditional angle of this was like also making some of these classes accessible to people who are not like based in the who weren't U.S. citizens who could like take classes internationally. So it was people from all over the world, like all walks of life, which is really interesting. But it ended up being like the fact that I had stayed at the Apple Store that semester while I was taking those first 4 classes. The fact that I stayed at NASA while I was doing those classes as well. So things got very busy very, very quickly. That's ultimately when I got my interview and internship offer to come back to work at Apple as a software engineer. So had I actually left and gone and done something else, like I perhaps wouldn't have had that opportunity. So in hindsight, I'm really glad. And then in the course of a very short amount of time, I did my interview to join Apple as an intern while I was doing my first semester at Harvard. And like the next week, I had applied for a bunch of other internships and got an interview at Disney to go do engineering down in Los Angeles, and ultimately like got the offer to join Disney.
Wow.
And it started at in January. So I had this plan of like moving to Boston that semester. In the coming January, and like that like kind of shifted under my feet as I was like, hey, this is a really, really cool opportunity. And also like had I been a part of a traditional program, I would not have had the capacity to do that. So I ultimately moved to LA in January of 2019, and like reduced my course load, and was only taking like 2 classes that semester because I was working full time at Disney at that point, and
Wow.
left the Apple Store.
Wow. That's such a, like it sounds like you had to do a lot of on the fly planning and reworking of your schedule. So you worked at Disney for a while as a software engineer.
Yeah, we,
Yeah.
we were doing like I think it was like system software engineering or something like that, but we were building roller coaster simulations, which was really, really cool. So we were part of we were a like embedded team at the Walt Disney Imagineering campus in LA, and focused on like again, improving ride throughput and like all these really interesting like roller coaster engineering
Yeah.
problems that like people don't think about, but like it's a very, very, very niche Disney thing. But
Yeah.
it was a ton of fun. It was my first like as a as a junior in college was like really embedded in this team and like was fortunate enough to work with like so many incredible people, and it was like I was a real member of the software engineering team. Like I was doing the same work as they were, hand in hand, side by side, the same level of responsibilities. It was like a very, very like people think about like sometimes internships and like you're getting coffee for someone or whatever. Like
Yeah.
this was like the very opposite end of the spectrum where I was like a true member of this team doing this work, and it was so like eye opening to have that experience and be able to like be a real contributor, and I loved it.
Yeah, wow. I saw a really cool like YouTube video about like Space Mountain and like the throughput in terms of like the number of people, how many different, you know, I guess trains they have going through the ride, and like
That's
how they
exactly what
engineered
we
all that.
would do. We would literally like build those simulations so that we could be like, okay, as we tweak these like few parameters and like we change the show or we like slow down the ride here, like how does that affect the overall number of people who we can get through this ride in one day without like lowering the experience for people?
Right.
So I worked for a long time on the I forgot the Tower of Terror in Florida. So we built that Tower of Terror simulation and like did a bunch of modifications. So I wonder if it's made any impact on the actual ride.
Yeah, man. That so I mean a lot of mechanical engineering types would be like their destination. Like after a long career, they're like, finally I'm at Disney where I wanted to be all along doing simulations on, you know, roller coasters. And you're here as a community college student who like or recent like you're here as like basically like a probably like a junior at Harvard taking this reduced load and working at Disney in LA. Like that's got to be a wild I mean, did you ever have to like wake up in the morning and like pinch yourself that like things are actually moving this quickly? Did you have any inkling that this would happen when you were, you know, a kid like sophomore year like playing Flappy Bird, that it would lead to this?
I don't think so. And I think like this goes back to like what is the value? Like I think Harvard is an incredible institution to like learn a bunch of stuff, but I also think like despite, you know, what everyone says and despite like all the trade-offs and downsides, like it does open up a lot of doors. And I think like
Yeah.
had I chosen to go to one of those other schools, like maybe I wouldn't have had that door open for me. And I'm fortunate and I'm glad that I was able to. But yeah, even looking back now, it's like again in hindsight it's like, oh yeah, this makes a lot of sense, but like in the moment it was like all of these like I'm like seeing the like splintering of the fabric of the universe in front of my eyes being like, this is weird, like I don't think this is what is supposed to be happening. But it goes back to like I didn't talk about this, but the amount of times that it takes to apply to some of these things when you're somebody whose early career is just like is a little bit mind dumbing. Like to get my job to get my internship at Apple during that time that I was working at the Apple store, I applied like 506 times to
Yeah.
different roles and opportunities only specifically at Apple. Like that wasn't including all the stuff at NASA, that didn't include Disney and like all these other times. 500 times just at Apple, and I got probably like 10 or 12 different interviews for like different teams for like random full-time jobs, which I was totally not qualified for and don't know why they were interviewing me because I was like working at the Apple store and a community college student, but somehow they were like, oh, this kid maybe could do something. But then ultimately got the one interview that led to my internship, which led to like my full-time job offer
Yeah.
out of those 500. And I think the lesson is like so many people that I talk to, even like folks who are very close to me who have like heard this story from my own mouth and like seen this experience with their own eyes, like they're like, yeah, you know, I applied like 5 or 6 times for this thing and like it didn't work out and therefore I'm going to move on to the next thing. And I have this post-it note sitting above my computer with the simple phrase which is measure in hundreds. And I think like people are so quick to measure things in a very like small way and like not see it work out and then move on to the next thing. And like you really need to measure in hundreds when you're that early in your career, because it just takes so like there's just so much blind luck that's involved.
That is an amazing anecdote that you have a post-it measure in hundreds. That's definitely a candidate for the title of this podcast episode. So let's talk about Harvard. I mean, when you eventually get over there as like a student, were you able to actually do 3 semesters there?
I did one. So in fall of 2019, I moved to Boston to Cambridge. And actually, at the time, my little brother had started that program at the University of Pennsylvania, which was, again, kind of like a hybrid type program. So he actually
Yeah.
moved to Cambridge with me, and we lived um, right by this fresh pond. If anyone lives in Cambridge, there's this pond that is really nice to go walk around and hang out near. But we lived right by Fresh Pond, and very, very overwhelming experience coming because at that time I was now essentially like a senior in college, like stepping onto this campus for the first time, like not knowing anyone, never having had that. It was actually like my first time ever going to Harvard, so it was this
You've never
very,
even been to the
very
campus?
never even been to Boston before, never been to the
Wow.
campus, like first time experiencing that, and it was just yeah, very, very, very overwhelming. I think, yeah, like it was like a fine first semester, but like all the like normal challenges you can imagine. Like at by the time it's senior year of college, like everybody has their friend group, like everybody has all these
Yeah.
other things going on. So like again, this was a very like I don't think I was like, very like um yeah, I'm a social person by default. So like I find some like social outlets. So like it's not like I was like sad because I didn't meet everyone. Like it wasn't like a depressing experience, but it was just like kind of interesting to like have the observation of like going in as like a complete outsider and like not really feeling a strong sense of like being a part of the culture. Um, and that ultimately led to like, well, we can talk more about it, but like me having the time and freedom and desire to like want to go do a bunch of open source stuff because I was like, hey, I'm not connecting with this community that I'm there in person with really. Like I have this community that I've connected with online and like would love to like do more around that. But yeah, did my first semester on campus, and then COVID happened, and
Yeah.
then spent the next spent the
Wow.
next 6 months hibernating inside of an apartment. Again, doing like it was a lot of bad stuff around COVID, and it was probably not the ideal timing, but like it also gave me the forcing mechanism to like spend my time inside contributing to open source and like
Yeah.
building my like next career step in that sense.
Well, let's talk about Julia Lang now because that is again a statistical language that's used by a lot of data scientists, a lot of scientists, and maybe you could talk a little bit how you got involved in that community and became one of the more prominent voices teaching, spreading the gospel of Julia.
Yeah, I was again another great example of like how you never know what's going to happen in life. So when I applied to the second team that I was on at NASA, I showed up the first day and they happened to be using a programming language called Julia. And like that's as simple as the story goes. And like as part of that process, this was before Julia had hit the 1.0 release. So like one of the first tasks was like helping migrate some of the initial code bases to like the point 0.7 release, which was like the precursor to the 1.0 one. And I like things were broken, like stuff wasn't well documented. So I just kind of like had to get involved in the community over time to like fix my own problems. Which is why I like met a bunch of people, and then ultimately like I was like, oh, there's all these really cool opportunities where I could actually contribute and start doing some of this like educational and community work, and just kind of like stepped in and initially ran our I don't know if you remember Google Code In, but it was like
Yeah.
Google's kind of Google Summer of Code, but for high school students. So
Mm-hmm.
you could build these tasks and help high school students. So I ended up running our initial engagement with Google Code In. We like mentored like 212 high school students. And it was like this incredibly empowering experience. And I was like, I really want to do more of this type of work. And I reached out to the folks who were like running the actual language and the development of the project and was like, hey, I love doing like I did this thing and like I loved it and I would love to do it in a more of an official capacity. And they were like, awesome, we'll bring you on the team. Join the team. And then like a month in, they were like, oh, we actually have this community manager title that like no one is using right now. And like yeah, like would you want to have that title? And I was like, naively, I was like, really had never heard of a community manager at that point. I was like, yeah, that kind of sounds fine. Like I'm happy to take that on. And they gave me that title. And then all of a sudden there was this sort of combinatorial explosion of like different things that now fell under the umbrella of what I was supposed to be doing. Yeah, and had to take on a lot more work once that happened.
Yeah, I can imagine. So maybe you can just give us a quick rundown of Julia language. Obviously, used by NASA, huge endorsement of its merit as a language for doing scientific computing. If you had to like pitch the audience on Julia as like, hey, it's worth learning Julia, like what would be your kind of elevator pitch for Julia?
Yeah, there's three things that so deeply resonate with me as far as why folks use Julia today. One of which is speed. So with Julia, you can get like C or C++ level code execution with a high level language still. So like with a high level language like Python, so it runs a lot faster than Python, but yeah, still easy to use. I think the second thing, and this is one of the things that's a little bit slept on, is the package ecosystem and the way that you manage packages in Julia just works. They built the language and they're like, let's really solve this problem and let's do a bunch of things from a core language design principle that makes it so that you don't run into all the annoying problems that you run into installing Python packages. So that's something that I love. Like I still just literally yesterday was running a bunch of code and I was like, why is it so annoying to install Python packages? So you don't have that problem in Julia. And I think the last thing is the language was really purpose built to make it so that you can like do everything in Julia, but also tap into other languages where it's useful. So like I think a lot of languages are like, oh, like we are the one solution that is going to do this. And like you need to move all your stuff to our language if you want to successfully use, Python as an example. And
Right.
Julia has first class interoperability support between it and like every other large language. So if you have like some Python code that you're really happy with, and you're like, I'm not getting rid of this Python code, that's fine. You can actually keep that Python code, put it directly into a Julia file, and then use Julia for what it's great for, and you keep using Python for what it's valuable for you as well. So I really love that as like a middle ground between like being super absolutist that you need to move everything
Yeah.
to one language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that seems like a very pragmatic way to position a language when you've got, the dominant like languages that are pretty entrenched. Like Python is, a big deal right now. And then of course you've got like R and even MATLAB at like the university research type level. So the fact that Julia, it seems very savvy of them to make it like, you don't have to adopt Julia whole hog, so to speak. You can just, incorporate it a little bit into your workflow.
Yeah, and really, I also think like Julia at the end of the day, like Python is so widely distributed that Julia is not really competing against Python. I think Julia is really competing against like the MATLABs of the world, and like nobody really likes MATLAB that much. Like MATLAB, you have to pay, like
Yeah,
it's
very expensive.
expensive. Yeah, it's a pain to use. Like Julia is really aimed at like targeting the core demographic of folks who are using MATLAB. Not really, like I think people who use Python can also use Julia, but it's really the MATLAB users that were like the core reason that the language
Yeah.
was built.
Well, I'd be excited to, well, first of all, I just want to take a moment to thank you for writing these excellent tutorials on Julia that we published on the Free Code Camp community publication. Tens of thousands of people have learned about Julia thanks to your thoughtful tutorials. So thanks for
I
making
love
time to
that.
do that.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's one of the most like rewarding things about writing stuff is knowing that like people actually went and read it and then we're able to like hopefully effectively like learn something new. So that's so cool.
Yeah, and I also want to talk a little bit about NumFocus, which is this really important charity that is, essentially overseeing like a lot of the key infrastructure that the entire scientific community relies on. And you're on the board of the charity. So that's a pretty big deal. I don't know how big the board is, but being a board member on a charity is like, that's not an easy feat to accomplish. And there's a lot of responsibility there. Maybe you can talk a little bit about NumFocus and they support like conferences like PyData. They're in charge of the projects like Jupyter Notebook, NumPy, like projects that developers use all the time that are dependencies in so many important applications. How did you get involved with NumFocus?
Yeah, it's a great question. So NumFocus is the fiscal host for a ton of open source projects, which what that means for folks who aren't super familiar is like if you want to donate money to the Pandas project or Jupyter or Julia or something like that, NumFocus basically acts as the legal entity and the bank account for these organizations so that open source maintainers like don't need to go and try to figure out how to set up a legal entity and don't need to figure out how to like pay people who are working on code for them and accept donations and do all the taxes. So they take care of all that administrative overhead, which is really incredible and freeing for projects. And I got connected through the ecosystem as I was taking on more ownership in the Julia community, and we needed someone. We NumFocus kind of wanted somebody who was representing some of the non-dominant language players on the board. So there was like 6 other board directors, and they were looking for folks who like could represent that perspective of projects that like weren't the dominant players and make sure that that voice was heard. So joined the board at NumFocus like over 2.5 years ago, and
Yeah.
it's been super interesting to see like there's so many.
How big is the board?
NumFocus has today it's like 6 people.
Okay. And how
Yeah,
frequently
and
do you
our
meet?
every other week. So
Oh,
there's
wow. So
we're
it's pretty
yeah, it's
involved.
very active for a nonprofit board. Like usually nonprofit boards meet like twice a
Quarterly.
year or something
Yeah.
like that.
Like
Yeah,
we meet
quarterly.
quarterly
So
at
yeah.
FreeCodeCamp, also a 501c3 public charity. Um, yeah. So you're meeting with them. What kind of things are you discussing? Like what would like, I mean, it's probably public information because you probably have to publicly publish the minutes and everything. So I hope I'm not prying, but like, what would a typical board meeting be like? What might be on the table?
Yeah, we're usually talking about like things that are on fire. So there's always a lot of things that are on fire when you have a like a really large like I think proportionally to the amount of developers that are like there is I was doing the numbers like I'm pretty sure the software that NumFocus that like NumFocus supports is like downloaded like 1 billion times a month or something like that. So
Yeah.
like it's a crazy amount of people and like scope for such a small organization to support. So like there's always things going wrong, and like as you know like nonprofits are like historically under resourced, so like we're trying to make a lot of things work with like duct tape and glue, and like
Yeah.
it's very it is very difficult. So it's a lot of those things. I think there's a decent amount of our time is focused on like how do we make sure that NumFocus as a nonprofit like stays like financially solvent. So like we're going and talking to large corporations about like how do we partner with them to like get money in the door. I know you have to do this all the time to like keep the lights on at Free Code Camp, and like it's not the most exciting thing to do sometimes, but like it's important. And like at the end of the day, we have all these open source projects that are relying on the services that we provide, and like if we don't stay solvent, if we don't keep the lights on, we can't pay people to do the work that's required to support these projects. So it's that is oftentimes like priority number one is how do we make sure we have money coming in the door so that we can provide services to projects. There's a bunch of fun stuff too, like getting to focus on and like help support a bunch of our Pi Data events, which are just like this global distributed network of events for developers who are building with the scientific tools that we support. But it's a lot of putting out fires. It's a lot of trying to make sure we have money coming in.
I can imagine. All right. So, of course, Logan, a little more than a year ago, you got a job at OpenAI, the company that everybody's been like focused on for the past, really since ChatGPT dropped. And of course, a lot of people were interested in it way back in GP2, era, using the playground and stuff like that. And I really enjoyed watching it evolve from something that was kind of a novelty, like this is cool, I can see how this could be useful, to something that I use probably like 8 or 10 times a day, right? So like it's a dramatic shift. And I'll say I didn't immediately see the value in ChatGPT 3.5, but like GPT-4, I was like, oh, this is really cooking. And a lot of people were like, I'm not sure if it's useful because it still hallucinates and stuff like that. But I was able to kind of push past that and really start to figure out ways that I could use this really productively. And the hallucination itself, I think, has decreased, but that's a whole lot for me to talk about. But basically, what I'm interested in hearing from you is like, how do you perceive this as somebody, both from the outside as a user of these tools, of the foundation model and of the many other ecosystem tools, and then maybe you can compare and contrast that with what it's like to actually work at OpenAI.
Yeah, it's incredible to see how much how everyone when GPT-4 came out was like, this changes everything. Like everything, whether I'm an engineer or in some other job, like this is going to change everything. And I think that's true in many ways. And then it's also interesting how subtly humans adapt to this change. And then now all of a sudden it went from this thing is crazy and it's going to change everything to like, hey, I'm just using this as a tool in my job 8 times a day. And like that's how I feel as an engineer, as somebody who's using ChatGPT and GPT-4 to like help me write better code. Honestly, is like the main use case that I'm playing around with these days. I want to ship some new feature, and like I'm not a TypeScript expert, and I want to go and have ChatGPT help me write better TypeScript code. And like honestly, it takes the first pass at like most of the code that I write these days. Like I'm not like scribbling things down by hand and like doing it myself. I'm having ChatGPT do it and then going in and debugging and troubleshooting. I think a lot of the like same skills that you learn in a computer science education, which is just like trying to fix things that are broken, essentially
Yeah.
is my like gut instinct of like what programming really is like very much true in the world of ChatGPT as well. Like sometimes it's going to make assumptions or hallucinate things or miss some context that you didn't give it, or it maybe just glossed over. And it's just that debugging trait, I think, as an engineer becomes like so much more important, and so much more like visible as you're using code that's been generated by AI in some capacity. Um, yeah, and I think for like on the inside, it's like absolute not absolute chaos from like the like chaos perspective, but like the speed at which people are moving is incredible to see, and I think it's like super inspiring, and it's something that I really like how fast we're building towards stuff, and like also not from like this like very high level like changing the world speed perspective, but it's like there are all these like very, very tangible problems that like people have brought up because like now there's millions of people who are using our platform and our tools. And like I appreciate the speed at which people are solving those problems. Like, hey, I'm a user, I have this bug. We go and tackle that like really, really quickly. And I love that. Like, hey, it would be awesome if as a developer, we had these higher levels of abstraction on top of some of the chat completions and completion tools. And like, awesome, we went and built assistants for people so that they don't have to manage the conversation history themselves. All those kinds of things. Like, there's just so much urgency in doing what users and developers are asking us for. And I love that.
Yeah. So as a developer, like you mentioned earlier, just like using it to kind of coach you on TypeScript, like here's some TypeScript I wrote, like how can this be more, I guess, succinct, or how can it be less prone to errors or something like that, right? Can you give some other examples of how you use GPT just like in your day-to-day workflow? Like, do you have like a chat GPT window open, or do you have some sort of like, Chrome browser extension that like hits the API and like does other stuff? Like, how do you consume GPT?
Yeah, I'm a big ChatGPT user. Like I actually I use sometimes I use like Copilot and Cursor. If folks have tried Cursor before, it's like a intelligent IDE that's like built with AI first primitives. But really, I like ChatGPT. I like having the same experience that our users do. And like honestly, what usually ends up happening is I go into one of the code bases that I'm working in. I copy a big TypeScript file and I paste it in ChatGPT and I say, hey, like here's the file that I'm working with. Like, this is what I want to do in plain English. I want to add X, Y, and Z feature. It should do, have these different characteristics. Like, help me do that. And ChatGPT literally will like take that first pass at like writing all the code that I need. I think the challenging part today for using ChatGPT to do this is like, again, there's like all this nuance of the context that it's missing. Like it knows what's in that file, but like it doesn't know the like 7 files that I've imported. And
Right.
like I can't really like in some cases I can copy and paste multiple files, but all that context is sometimes overwhelming to the model. Just like and I love drawing these analogies, like just like it would be overwhelming for a human. Like if I
Yeah.
went and sent you like 1,000 lines of code and I'm like, oh, help me do this thing. You're like, okay, hold on. This is going to take me a while because
Yeah.
that's a lot of code to digest. So I think people oftentimes like forget that these models are trained oftentimes in like ways that humans interact and understand and read things. So like some of the limitations that we run into are the same limitations that that the models are going to run into. And like hallucinations is a great example of this as well. Like I might say something that like in my probability distribution in my head is like very true, and like that does not mean that like it is an empirical fact in the world, just because like I feel deeply that it's true, and like the models are exactly the same way, like based on the information the model was trained on, it thinks something is true. Does that mean that it's agreed upon by everybody in the world? Probably not in a lot of cases, but
Right.
it's interesting to have that perspective.
I mean, eventually you start to get into philosophy and like epistemology and like, uh, what is the nature of truth? What is the nature of reality? Like, how
Yeah.
could this be expressed in, how do you arrive at a consensus on this? How do you express like balance? Like some scientists believe this, but there's some small contingent that believes this. You know, like it doesn't necessarily have the. If it went into every single pedantic detail, people would stop using GPT, right? They'd be like, "Oh my goodness!" It's like ask, asking a dictionary or something like that, right? Like
Yeah.
it has to figure out kind of like how to cut to the chase and figure out what to assume away, right? In terms of giving terse answers that are actionable. And at the same time, you know, GPT does apologize for itself a lot. And it's always kind of like, well, there's not yet like consensus on this, or there's not, like I don't have the latest version of information on this, so events could have changed. And there's all this kind of like almost boilerplate that sometimes shows up in the responses. And I think a lot of that is just an admission that reality is incredibly complicated or
Yeah.
complex, even. Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's why I'm kind of excited for agents to like go out and be able to like get some of that like in the moment context that would be like really helpful, and like
yeah,
get like the yeah, get a lot of the nitty gritty details, because it is like I hear people in the feedback that like it's kind of frustrating sometimes when the model gives you answers like that, where it's like trying to be nuanced, but like it just ends up not being really nuanced and it's just kind of like bleh.
yeah.
So I hear people on that, and like I think there's like a bunch of really interesting like technical and like social things that we'll hopefully be able to try and see if that helps improve those situations.
Yeah, like what do you think the most immediate wins that are going to be realized over the next few years with we'll talk specifically about ChatGPT and this kind of like conversational user experience. What do you think the like is it increasing the context window? Is it speeding up the processing? Like what are the biggest things that you think are going to have the most profound net benefit to people like me and you that just use GPT to get things done all day?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think those two that you mentioned, speed, context windows, are huge ones. I think there needs to be more reasoning that happens at the model level. Today, the model is like truly just a token predictor. Like
Yeah,
it is going, you're going to put something in, it's going to predict the next token. Like there is like people like use that as some proxy for it like thinking behind the scenes, but it's not thinking. Like it is truly just generating tokens. So I think there needs to be some ability for the model to like actually think about problems. And I don't know what that will look like. I also think like from a tooling perspective, I think the models need to be able to like go and fetch the information that it does not know the answer to. It needs to be able to like actually go and get you empirical information. And like today, the model is too likely to just kind of like give you the answer that it thinks is going to be true without like validating that in some cases. And like oftentimes it's still correct, but like it would be nice to like see some proof of work and like know
yeah.
that it's actually done this computation, or it's gone and pulled up these certain things to make sure that something is true. I think that's going to be awesome. And I think the very last like very tactical piece is today, and again, using the human analogy, the models are so inclined to just answer the question that you asked it.
Right.
And I think that's partially because of the way that the model is trained and it wants to like provide value as soon as possible. But like
Right.
in
It's
a comp,
oh, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just want to riff on what you were saying. Like, if you were to ask a university professor, they would step back and say, well, a better question would be XYZ. But because it's a bot, essentially, it's in this, there's this power dynamic. Like, the user is so much more powerful than the bot that's doing the user's bidding, and it doesn't want to, like, upset you or get all uppity or something like that, because humans are like, I'm the user, damn it. Like, do what I say. And so to some extent, it might give you what it thinks you want to hear, as opposed to like gently pushing back and saying, well, that's not the right question to be asking, or something like that, right?
yeah,
It'd
this
be
has a
cool if there
lot
was
to
like
do with how the,
professorial mode or something like
I
that. Maybe
agree.
maybe that's just a prompting thing. Like, you're an academic, you know, you're an expert in this field, and you don't mind pushing back against my naive questions or something like that. Maybe if I prompted it differently, I could get that kind of experience. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt your flow, but I just wanted to point that out, that a lot of the frustrations people may have is just by design of, like, it is a product that it wants people to use it, right? Like, so there are some accommodations that have been made to make it not, like, extremely like contrarian or something.
Yeah, and to go like one level deeper on like why this actually happens, like this is a very like intentional design decision that's been made. So like the whole like the model essentially it has this pre-training stage where it has this large corpus of information. It's trained on all that like large corpus of text, and really the goal is like just predicting the next token based on all that text. After it finishes that process, it goes into this reinforcement learning with human feedback loop. And this is where it sort of learns this behavior of like, how do I interact with humans? How do I give answers to the questions that they're asking? And like, if you were to like really plain and simple, like look at the data that's being trained for these models for that reinforcement learning with human feedback cycle, it's like, I have this question. Here's the answer to the question. I have this question. Here's the answer to this question. Like that's the way that the model has been trained, which is why it acts like that. And there are things you can do. Like the prompting is a great example of this. Like you can, and I've seen a bunch of great examples online of people using custom instructions or GPTs to be like always ask me clarifying questions. Like always come to me and like try to help me get to a better like a better base question. And that really does improve the performance of the model. But I think it's also like very fundamentally, it's a byproduct of the way that these models are trained. And I think like in the future, we'll have probably models that are like trained in a slightly different way that like maybe push back on people a little bit more if they want that.
Yeah. And do you think do you think there's gonna be like a bifurcation of products, in the sense that like you can choose the model that's more like concerned with like probabilistic veracity and things like that, versus just being more amiable?
I think we've really focused on building like general purpose models that can do a lot of these different use cases well. So I'm hopeful that like I think you actually probably could today take some problem space and like integrate like 25 different models and like have some really like complex logic about like what models are used in what situations and what types of questions. I think like that's possible. I don't think you'll end up getting the best solution to a lot of the things by doing that because there's so much nuance. And I think what
Yeah.
probably makes the most sense is like just having one great model that hopefully is trained on like this really nice distribution of data that can answer questions and like put it in different modes and stuff like that.
Well, that brings me to another question, which is the developer ecosystem. People adopting the OpenAI API. You were OpenAI's first developer advocate hire, famously, and so one of the big things you're doing is trying to get people to adopt this and build on top of it. And I'm curious, like, what are some of the companies in the space that are, in your assessment, doing a really good job of building on top of the OpenAI API?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think one of my favorites, people who have done this in a really thoughtful way is Khan Academy. Khan Academy was one
Mm-hmm.
of the original GPT-4 launch partners, and we got them early access to the model, and they were really pushing on like, Sal Khan's, this is like hits close to home for you, I'm sure, because I think there's a lot of
Yeah.
parallels between FreeCodeCamp and Khan Academy, but I think Sal Khan's vision is being able to give students, like every student in the world class education and enabling that using like personalized AI tutors, and they released this Conmingo product and did such an incredible, like, there's so much nuance in bringing AI to students around the world and having it actually be like an amplifier and not a tool that just like people use as a crutch. And I think Conmingo has like really
Yeah.
threaded the needle on this super well. Like if folks have tried the product before, it actually like, despite the model really wanting to give an answer and like being trained in many cases to like just give you the answer to the question that you asked, they've done a bunch of things to add guardrails so that students using Conmingo don't actually just get the answer when they ask for the question. They like actually get like the reasoning, and like they get more questions. Like the question goes back to them about like, how would you approach this, like how, like, here, maybe here are some things to think about, and like trying to guide people
Yeah.
towards the answer. And it's a really great, like they've done a great job of like the intersection between like the core technology and like the user experience, like really matching up in this perfect harmony.
Yeah. Yeah. And Khan Academy, of course, I think you and I have both read Sal Khan's book.
Yeah,
And yeah, like what they're doing for kids, Free Code Camp's aiming to do for busy adults, essentially.
I love that.
We're not yet using, um, we don't yet have a chatbot. We decided to like wait until it was like a little bit more mature because there wasn't like any urgency. We've already got this forum where we do essentially that. Like we use kind of a Socratic method of helping people answer their own questions, essentially, rather than just, here's the answer, right? Because I mean, there's plenty of wikis, and like every single Free Code Camp challenge has like the solutions probably a million places all over the internet. But if you don't want the raw solution, if you want to be guided toward the answer and like make the same kind of like cognitive leaps that would be involved in discovering that for yourself, like you can kind of do that just through conversation. And that's where I'm really bullish on using GPT. Is one of the big things I use it for is language learning. And so I'll ask a lot of questions like, can you guide me toward, and I'll ask these in different foreign languages. So, but I'll ask questions about what would be a usage pattern that would work really well in this situation, and maybe try not to get it to give me an exact sentence, but maybe just a structure, and then I can say like this, and then it'll be like, oh yeah, like that. That's a, or not quite. This is more like try doing this, try using this grammatical marker or whatever, right? So yeah, I mean that's awesome. What are some other companies that are using the OpenAI API in interesting ways that you think are impactful and that you think represent like something that other companies could seek to emulate?
Yeah. Another really interesting one on the topic of like interfaces that like really bring this technology to life. I don't know if you've seen the demos of TL Draw. Um,
I haven't.
it's this interface where it's essentially like a blank canvas, and you can use prompting to like, and drawing to like generate images and a bunch of other stuff. But the basic idea is like the form factor for AI today for so many people is like chat experiences, and people like chat, they do text in, text out, maybe add some images. And I think TL Draw is really pushing on this idea that like what maybe could be more useful than chat in some cases is this like infinite canvas experience, and being able to like, take all these different like, our lives are very, like, I'm looking at my desk, it's like almost this infinite canvas that I have in my physical world, and it like brings to life all the things that I need. And I'm really excited for AI experiences to move more towards things like that, where like there are these
Yeah,
very unique interfaces which like actually bring this technology to life in a very different way than just like a chat in
awesome.
and out. So yeah, I think 2024 we're going to see so many more products that are like that, where it's like this
Yeah,
different user experience.
I'll link to a demo. I'll see if I can find a demo, but maybe you can just describe verbally like how it works. So like I draw something and then it's like this. Like does it enhance my stick figures, or how does it work?
Yeah, exactly that. So it's using like image models and some vision models and text prompting models to take what you draw and actually turn it into something super crazy. And that's just like one, like that. That's like they've built all of these different demos, but it's really like the underlying technology that powers that demo is this like infinite canvas experience where like you can go and like interact with like AI and also like multiplayer with other humans and like really like bring some of this stuff to life that I don't think like traditional chat experiences really allow you to do. So it's super cool.
Yeah. And multimodal is like a big thing that GPT has been incorporating, and just the notion that you can like feed in images, you can feed in potentially video, you can feed in like all kinds of different media into it, and then it can kind of riff on that. And that's something that, like, what are some ways that you see that being impactful over the next year or two?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think like vision is one of the biggest unlocks for these systems. Like when I was working at Apple as a machine learning engineer, the project that I was working on was being able to predict the trade-in price of an iPhone based on pictures of it. So actually, if you go into the store today and you trade in your phone, they do this. They take pictures, they run the machine learning model that we trained, and it predicts based on the condition of the phone the price of it. And a very, very difficult machine learning problem because of all these different constraints. And I saw vision come out, and it was this moment where I was like, there's so many of these types of problems in the world, and like they're very, very narrow problems, but they require this deep and nuanced understanding of the world and all of these different things. And that model can actually do, like the vision model can do way better probably at this problem than this like very domain specific custom model that we spent hours and hours, weeks and weeks, months and
Wow.
months training. And it's super interesting. I think there's going to be like tons of those like really small use cases that are unlocked now because you have a model that like really understands the world. I think like going back to language learning you mentioned, like one of the coolest use cases I've seen for vision so far has been like people traveling in other countries, and you can literally just like snap a picture of some random building in Italy and be like, tell me the history of this, and like really bring it to life for me. And like
Yeah.
you have this personalized guided tour now of everywhere in the world by just like taking pictures of things, which I don't think was possible before.
Yeah, and probably even a lot of like very mundane things like what bird is this? Like, things like
Yeah,
that. Like,
yeah.
and of course there are lots of bird computer vision apps that have been in the App Store for probably years at this point, but just the fact that there's a single model that's kind of powering all this stuff is new. And one of the things that surprised me learning more about GPT-4 and about LLMs in general is just how surprising a lot of the emergent properties of just having such a massive model have been. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that is just mind blowing. The fact that, like, for example, you can dramatically improve illustrations by teaching, or essentially by having it like verbalize to itself, like, oh, this property, like using English language as kind of like an intermediary step between one drawing and another drawing, as I naively understand it working. Can you
Yeah,
explain how that works?
yeah, I don't know if I'll have a good explanation or like what the right direction to take it is, but I think the what you mentioned is very true. And actually to like abstract it to like developers a little bit more, the text being this like interface layer between like text for large language models is essentially like thought for humans. Like,
Yeah.
when I want to do something, I think about it. Text is really that interface layer. Like as you're building different applications, incorporating different modalities, whether it's like image generation or image understanding or text generation or speech even or like audio processing, the layer between all of those is text. And I think it's really fascinating that that's like one of the emergent characteristics of all of these things is like that it's text that's the interface between all those. And I don't think like if you had asked people 20 years ago what would be like, I think people would have assumed that like, I don't know, the models would be like talking binary to one another or
Yeah.
something like weird and abstract and esoteric like that. And it's actually really cool for us as humans to be able to see like it is actually tech, like they're actually doing kind of the same thing that we're doing, which is really interesting.
Yeah. And like, I mean, text is kind of the stuff of thought, language, right? And so it is really interesting that computers can work very similar to how humans work. Now, obviously, like kind of like your internal monologue and like all these different things are only one part of memory, only one part of experience. But I think as a complete layperson who doesn't know much about psychology, I do feel that like a lot of the ways I code things into my memory are how I kind of think about them in terms of language. Like, it was a splendid day, and man, that sunset looked just like, a smashed bottle of champagne against like a yacht or something. Like, I don't know, just like random, like kind of ways that I would like just have these little insights, and they'd stick with me, ways of thinking. Or when you read a book, I mean, books can be so illustrative, and it's just words on a page, and yet it can be this really vivid experience. If you're reading a well-written book, it can almost feel like you're like having a dream. It can be that level of resolution. So it's very interesting that computers can work so similar to like how humans work, and that even though like an artificial neural network is not exactly like the neural network that we're using in our brain, that so much of it is like the degree of similarity is staggering to me, that is what we arrived at. It wasn't like semantic logic or one of these other branches of AI that we've been going down for the past 60 years, but it was neural networks that got us there. And I'm not saying that it's like the last step. I'd be interested in your thinking. Like, do you think that we've kind of hit on something here, and that this is the way we get to artificial general intelligence is through using neural networks? Or do you think that it's going to be some combination of different disciplines, or do you think this will get us there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there fundamentally needs to be like additional layers. Like I still think there's a ton of breakthroughs. My intuition is that you could sort of take the existing GPT paradigm and like it will continue to scale up, like the GPT-5s, the GPT-6s of the world, whatever in the future. But there will have to be like fundamentally different changes. Like just transformers, just like next token prediction is like a very poor proxy for like what actual general intelligence. And again, maybe that will turn out to be wrong, and like this will be the thing that works really, really well and continue to scale. But I think they'll have to be like going back to that like reasoning piece. Like I think reasoning is something that has to really happen for these models to start like taking on much more complex tasks like that we as humans do today.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we can talk philosophically about like AI, but I want to get back into the kind of the nitty gritty of Logan Kilpatrick and his journey into OpenAI. So you joined like right after ChatGPT hit the world and became like the fastest adopted consumer product of all time, basically. What was it like? Because it was a pretty small organization. It is a 501c3 charity that's kind of like swallowed this giant whale of a for-profit entity, but like, and you've got like Microsoft there. You've got like so many different things going on. You've got this incredibly charismatic founder. You've got all these brilliant and many idealistic people that work at OpenAI. Like, what was it like? First of all, I guess maybe first question, how did you get that job? And then maybe you can talk about what it was like starting that job.
Yeah, I started interviewing back in like June of 2022 and literally just applied online. I was like, hey, was thinking about doing something different and found a job, applied online, started interviewing, and at the time they were actually by the time like I got to the actual like in-person interviews and started going through some of the rounds, I had moved back to Chicago and they were looking for someone in San Francisco at the time. So I was like, yeah, it's not for me. I just moved back. I love my girlfriend. She's in Chicago. They ended up reaching out like 3 months later and they're like, hey, we're actually willing to hire someone remotely now. And like continued the interview process. Ultimately ended up getting the job offer, accepted, did all this stuff. The whole pitch to begin with was like, hey, we have these models like GPT 3.5, like it's incredible. It can do so much stuff, but like developers don't really know what to build with this. Like, come help us help develop, like figure out how to help developers like build really cool things. And they were like, yeah, we also have these other like really, really crazy models, but like we can't tell you about it till you join, which ultimately ended up being GPT-4. But again, at the time, like it was not clear that like it was about to be this breakaway success of like all this like crazy stuff that people associate with OpenAI today. And my first day was the tweet by Sam of OpenAI or of ChatGPT hitting 1 million users, and it kind of like started to like really the narrative started to blow up from there. When I joined, I was on our like developer platform team, and at the time it was like 6 or 7 people who were like building the entire API and all of the infrastructure for developers, like literally just that 6 or 7 person team. Really, really small and like moving so quickly. And I think the thing that like people don't pick up on sometimes is like you have this like moment of success, and then all of a sudden we have like millions and millions of people showing up to use ChatGPT. We have millions and millions of people showing up to use our developer platform. Your intuition is like, oh, like perfect. You know, you have money. We'd like raised money from Microsoft, and we announced it at that time as well. Just go hire a bunch of people. And like, I think people who have not been close to the hiring process don't realize like how it like takes time to like spin up that hiring engine. So even by the time we got to the GPT-4 launch and the ChatGPT API launch in March of 2023, like we still really hadn't grown that significantly because like it takes time to
Yeah.
interview people. Like people have to leave their jobs, they have to move, they have to do all this stuff.
Yeah, it's really
So
counterintuitive too. Just for anybody who hasn't worked on an engineering team, like just what you were talking about earlier, getting context into the legacy code base, understanding like just the human element of being on a team and interacting with new people, who's doing what, like what do I do? Like there's so much kind of onboarding necessary to get somebody from being like, I mean, frankly, like a net negative when they're first starting out. They're taking time away from other things so they can gradually get up to the break even, and then ultimately they'll be a net positive. And the longer they stay, the more kind of return on investment you get on bringing them onto the team. But
yeah.
there's definitely like a spooling up process, and I can only imagine what it would be like with all that pressure on. Basically, everybody like the dominant like I saw like the top article on Wikipedia for 2023 was, I think it was OpenAI or ChatGPT, one of those two, right? So I can only imagine, and then everybody's like expecting like magic Microsoft money to just instantly make everything better. But the reality is there's still a lot of work to do, even when you have the resources to bring on good people, right?
Yeah, and we've been like the caliber of folks who have joined the team is so incredibly high and so amazing. Like I actually think a lot of people, and this is like I think become implicitly part of OpenAI's culture, but like you join, and I've worked with so many people who have joined it. Their first week, they're like a major contributor to some like huge launch. Like I've like the ChatGPT API, like we had folks joining like literally that week, and they just like saddled up and like started shipping code. And like it's
Wow.
incredible to see. Like, so, I mean, there is still that like spin up time, but I think also when you like you can sort of mitigate some of that by finding folks who have experiences that that like really translate well to building what we're building. And like we're fortunate enough from a API side to like get a bunch of folks from like places like Stripe who have built this incredible developer platform and a bunch of APIs that are similar. So it does help like reduce that spin up time, and then folks like ship stuff on their first day, which is crazy and
Yeah.
like not the normal. There's so many places like, and again, this is not like a picking on Facebook or casting judgment on them, but like, Facebook's like one of their core things was like you join and you go through like a 6-week Facebook like engineering like boot camp essentially to like learn the things that
Yeah.
Facebook does, and it's like a very different culture than like than at least in the context of OpenAI.
Well, I mean, to some extent, it sounds like you all didn't necessarily have the time and energy to build up that system. I mean, you said the engineering team was like 6 people building ChatGPT and building the opening. So, like, maybe you could talk about the composition of the company or the charity. I'll just use the word company because I know, like, I'm from the charity.
The charity owns the actual capped profit company, but like all the like the majority of the employees work for the capped profit. So like I work for a capped profit that's owned by a nonprofit.
And the capped profit, just in case anybody's curious what that means, essentially it's like a traditional, company where people hold stock, but the people who invest, like they can the maximum amount of money they can get out is 100x their initial investment or something like that, right?
I don't know what it is specifically for us, but that's part of the intent is like there's some capped amount of upside for investors and employees, and then the rest of the upside like flows back to that charity,
right.
Which has like a fiduciary duty to benefiting humanity,
yes,
instead of a fiduciary duty to like maximizing profits for shareholders, which is the normal structure.
Yeah, so a lot of people might be like, well, why is this a nonprofit? How is this a charity or something? Like legally, I've spent a lot of time studying it. Like it's a different type of charity from like the Red Cross or Doctors Without Borders or Free Code Camp, but it is still technically a charity, and like I don't think that's a controversial thing inside the charity world or anything. But I guess I'll just call it the company since you're within the capped for profit that's inside the charity. So one question I have for you is like you said that like there were like 6 or 7 people working on the actual products that people were using. Like what proportion of the team when you joined was just scientists, like people actually doing the training of the models and building, doing the basic science that would ultimately be productized. What proportion of the team was that versus the actual engineering and product side?
Yeah. So we had like those 6 or 7 folks just on the API side. ChatGPT has like a separate, it's a separate team from like our
Mm-hmm.
API developer platform team. So I think there was at least a few, probably like, I don't know at that time whether I was going to say a dozen, but that sounds much too ambitious
Yeah, so it was
for
even
the
fewer than a
ChatGPT.
dozen, basically, that
Yeah, I
built
think it was like
the actual user interface.
yeah, exactly. And the research team is very intentionally small. I think it was probably a much larger portion when I joined. I was like employee like 280 or something like that. At the end of last year, we were at like 750 people, so a ton of growth. And it's interesting, like the research team has not grown significantly. And I saw a great tweet from one of the researchers on our team who was actually talking about how in many cases, and this is kind of unintuitive, especially coming from an engineering world where I don't think this is necessarily always true, but for every new incremental researcher you add to a research organization, it's actually like a net loss for every other researcher, like independent of like the like helping that person onboard. You could never talk to that person in your time as a researcher, and it would still be a net loss for you for that person to join in general. And
Why?
the reasoning is because you have this allocation, this pool of GPUs. And if you're a researcher and you need the currency of research
Ah,
at OpenAI is GPUs, you now have to give off 1,000 of your GPUs to some other person who's going to try a bunch of other stuff in their research. And like all of a sudden, you're now less effective as a researcher because you can't try as many things, you can't scale things up as much. And again, there's nuance to this.
wow.
Like you could come in with some optimization technique that enables everyone to be more effective, and then now it's like a plus 10% GPUs for everyone or something like that. But it's interesting, and that's part of the reason why our research organization hasn't scaled up a ton is
That's
because
interesting.
you need GPUs, and we live in a world where we're constrained by the number of GPUs.
It's interesting. It's almost like we're going back to the days of like the mainframe when like researchers would fight for time slot to actually use the computer because the GPU is so expensive and so scarce. That becomes the gating factor rather than the actual human talent. In some
It's also
respects.
funny that it's like you can have all the money in the world. That doesn't actually matter. Like I could show up like today, I could personally have $1 billion of cash to go and buy, and it doesn't matter because there aren't any GPUs to buy. Like there are no
Right?
free
They're on back
GPUs.
order.
Yeah, they're on back order for like years, and it's like this super long spin up process to get more GPUs. And I think that's why like us working so closely with Microsoft and Azure, like they've been an incredible partner in
Yeah.
like getting us the resources that we need to continue to push on the frontiers of these models and serve traffic to ChatGPT customers. So I don't think anyone is. I have nothing but good things to say about Azure. I don't think
Yeah.
anyone is like pushing on things as much as Azure is from a GPU perspective.
So are there a lot of efforts to try to figure out ways like I guess compression hacks to like reduce the size of the model dramatically so you need fewer GPUs to be able to run it and train it, or like I assume that there are lots of different branches of research into that to like kind of try to solve that bottleneck.
Yeah, 100%. I think there's been ongoing stuff. Like there's actually been things that we've done that have led to like the model potentially in some cases being smaller. But in principle, it's like there's only so much of that you can do without some like crazy new breakthrough. Like a lot of that work is actually like more like pure engineering effort. Like you can do a lot of things to like make it so that the models are smaller and more efficient and stuff like that. And like it's more from a engineering perspective. I think like there really needs to be some research breakthroughs. And I think a lot of people are actually like Microsoft is doing some of this work. I've seen others doing this work, like the small model sort of movement of like how much can you get with some of these smaller models. And I think it's important that people do that research
Yeah.
because there's a lot of use cases that don't work or aren't feasible today because of how large these models are.
Could there be like a SETI at home type solution for training models, or is it just fundamentally like a different engineering problem where like having a whole bunch of compute on a whole like millions of computers like SETI at home, if you're familiar with that, like that was like the search for extraterrestrial life. They had a whole bunch of I guess data that they needed to munge, and the way that you could help was you could install this thing whenever your computer was idling, it would help crunch on the data for SETI and send it back to them. I mean, could there be like an equivalent type effort where you could have people opt in to use their computer, or is it you're digging for coins in the couch at that point? Like, would that work in any
I,
way?
yeah, I think at the scale that we operate today and like the scale that we'll operate in the next few years, like, I'm just kind of making up this based on my intuition, so I don't
Yeah,
actually have the real numbers, but like, I don't think that that would make like, even if you got like every iPhone in the world signed on to this thing to like give its spare compute, I don't think you would actually, it would end up giving like that much net benefit.
okay,
Just because like it's like, if you look at the hardware that's used to train models, it's like the A100s and H100s are like custom built, like science experiments that are like built for one thing. And it is like very expensive and does that one thing really, really well. And like, I don't think like the hardware would actually allow you to do what you need to do.
do you know if like Google's TPU, like the tensor processing units and things like that, are those like competing for foundry space over in Taiwan at what is it, Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation,
Yeah.
TSMC? Like, uh, is there any like clear kind of like opening, like I guess end to this bottleneck in sight, or is it just going to be years and years of like having to build out additional foundry capacity? Like I think we're doing that here in the U.S. It's just kind of like an energy independence for compute type movement. But like how long do you think it's going to remain a key constraint?
Yeah, I'm guessing if you dig a little bit into this, and I'm not an expert at all, I've just like read a few articles here and there, but it's actually fascinating that there's like all of these all of these points of failure in that existing system today, and it's unclear to me like how much is by design because there's like lots of corporate interests and such involved, but like one of the like machines that you'll need is like only made by this one
Yeah,
company, and like it's like the one company that supplies all of these types of machines for every fab, and it's like, well, they don't make any more of those because like they're also constrained by these five other things, and it's just like
yeah,
this incredibly complicated supply chain. I think like there are a bunch of like bright opportunities. Like I think like bringing some of those back to the US, bringing fabs back to the US is going to be super important. South Korea has become like a huge location for
yeah.
new
You went
fabs,
to
and like
South
they're built.
Korea. I heard.
Yeah,
Like I saw on
I
Twitter
was
you
in
were there
South Korea.
for how long? Like 3 days?
Like literally, I was 36 hours flying, 36 hours on the ground.
That is crazy. What did you do while you were
Yeah.
there? What was so important that you endured all that jet lag and all that travel?
We're doing an event with the South Korean government, the Ministry for Small Business, and yeah, we're fortunate enough to like get to hear from and essentially be like see the pitch from 20 plus South Korean startups and see some of the stuff that they're working on. It was super empowering
Yeah.
to see like the innovation's not just happening in San Francisco. It's not just happening in the US. Like there's people all over the world who are pushing on it and pushing on like the very regional problems as well. Like so many startups in South Korea, like logistics and the supply chains of Asia are like top of mind for them. And they're really, really interesting solutions and like using the models in different ways to try to solve some of that stuff. So it was super cool
Yeah.
to see that. It was a ton of fun.
Well, I don't want to tease any proprietary data out of you or anything like that. But just like in terms of the next big model, like GPT-5 or GPT 4.5 or something like that, like how soon do you think we're likely to see that? Has any of that work commenced in terms of like in earnest? Have they actually started training models at this point?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure whether or not like what the status of training stuff is just because I'm abstracted away from it. So I won't comment on that. I think my assumption, just like as somebody who's like followed the progression of these models, is that, like hopefully we'll have something cool this year and like Yeah, I mean, I'm biased and like I love
Yeah.
developer stuff, so like I'm hopeful that it comes out on Developer Day. Like that'd be a ton of fun to like showcase something like that to the world. But yeah, I think it'll be really cool, and people have such high expectations for whatever we do next. So I think that adds a ton of
Yeah.
pressure for us to build something incredible that people want, and I have a ton of faith in the team. Like I think the scaling laws are in our favor, and like there's a like GPT-4 was the first model. This was part of the technical report that we released. It was the first model where we could like reliably predict how powerful that model was going to be and the capabilities based on the amount of compute that we put in. So I'm really fascinated to see like when the next iteration of this model comes out, like does that scaling law hold true or not? So it'll be interesting to see.
In terms of like using software on top of the model to like improve the quality of results and stuff like that, like this is a super vague question and it might seem like extremely ignorant, but like what percentage of performance juicing can we get out of just like good software engineering on top of the model that we already have? Like let's say hypothetically there was never a GPT-5 and we just had to deal with the tech that we have today. How much better do you think we could improve it just by new prompting techniques or new frameworks and things like that sitting on top of it, consuming the API and like mixing that with other techniques?
Yeah, there's probably a pretty close like end of the line threshold. I think people would figure. I mean, I think there's like always going to be interesting innovation that you could do around prompt engineering and stuff like that. But I do think like GPT-4 has a bunch of fundamental limitations, and it's like just because of the data that it's been trained on and like how long it's been trained and all that stuff. So I think we do need new models. I'd imagine you could probably like really cleverly figure out with a lot of engineering work like how to get like 50% better performance or something like that. But even still, it's like, what does that 50% actually look like? Like, what does it mean
It's
along
going to be
which
subjective,
access?
probably, right?
Yeah,
There will be like
like,
all the benchmarks and stuff to evaluate it. Maybe better performance on some esoteric test that nobody takes, right?
exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So last question, free form question. What are some things that people could be using GPT for and the OpenAI API that they don't that they may not necessarily realize it's extremely good at and useful for? Like maybe if you could just list off some use cases that you think are really interesting and that people may not be aware of that they might be able to go and try themselves.
Yeah, I think that this is the most exciting reason for the GPT store. So like the reality is like as somebody who's using AI, like I live in Chicago and I talk to people all the time who like aren't part of the AI or technology bubble, and they go and use ChatGPT and they're like, what do I do? Like it's this blank thing and like it's not super clear to me. I think GPT's really solved this problem. Like you have this very tangible experience that you're sending to someone. Like, it could be things as simple as like generating logos for your company, like doing goal planning. Like I was working on a GPT to like help me plan my like not OKRs, but like the similar version
Yeah,
of
OKR,
OKRs and like
which is basically like a performance review
yeah,
for
like
team members that you manage or something like that, right?
exactly, like planning all the different things that I need to actually go and do. And I my girlfriend made Planty, which is like a house plant GPT and for gardening, and you can like get advice on how to like take care of your plants, and hopefully none of my plants will die because I'm using Planty to like help keep them alive. Like there's so many like every tangible thing that you could imagine is possible with GPTs, and now we have the GPT store, and you can go in and like search for some of these things, use them, and like there's so much more that we're going to push on with GPTs to allow them to like actually take actions on your behalf. So like plan a trip for you and like help you book the tickets and like find stuff like that. We talked about like the tour guide example. Like I
Yeah.
think all of those are such exciting use cases.
And it's going to take a while for all these use cases to shake out. Like, I mean, we're still figuring out new uses for spreadsheets, 30 years later, right? 40 years later.
Yeah.
So, well, it's been an absolute privilege learning so much from you, Logan, hearing about your own developer journey, the tenacity, the measuring in hundreds as you've applied for various jobs and been incredibly successful at applying to companies, applying to universities, and getting on the board of NumFocus again. I just want to emphasize what a huge deal that is. you have so much power and so much responsibility helping oversee and sustain these various, scientific computing projects that we all rely on, whether we know it or not, every day. So I just want to thank you again for coming on. And I want to emphasize that anybody who is interested in AI should definitely be following Logan on Twitter. He's got a pretty active Twitter account there. He writes a lot on Medium. Hopefully we'll get some more FreeCodeCamp tutorials at some point when he has some time about various things. If you want to write about OpenAI's API or something like that, we would be thrilled to publish some stuff on that. But I just want to thank you for coming on, man. I'm going to add some notes, show notes that include some links to some various things we've talked about and also things that Logan thinks you might be interested in. So thanks again for coming on, man.
Quincy, this was a ton of fun, and hopefully like the takeaway for folks is like you can do it. Like there's so much opportunity in the world, and I think especially with everything that's happening in AI, like this is such a moment to get involved in a new space. And like the beautiful thing is like there's no experts. Like this just started. Like you can get in and like in 6 months like be the person that people are going to. And like I felt this myself of like people think that I'm an expert in AI. Like I'm in the shoes of a lot of everybody else. Like I just started doing a lot of this stuff like super recently. So it's such a cool opportunity. I'm excited for the developer space. Thanks for having me on. And I'm happy that we got to chat.
Absolutely. Well, everybody, thanks for sticking with us. I hope you learned a lot. Until next week, happy coding.